Well, look at who we have here. Look who the podcast dragged in today. How are you there, friend? Thank you very much for pressing play and joining me. You are not going to be sorry is a phrase I know I often use. I should be better, but come on. One of the all-time stand-up with Pete Dominic greats, David Cay Johnston, joins me today. Of course, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, wrote 3 books on Trump, wrote 3 books on economics and taxes specifically, and such a brilliant journalist who I'm very happy to have joining me for this wide-ranging conversation that you can hear if you want to jump to it right now and skip the news segment. It begins at about 28 minutes in, but a whole cavalcade, an avalanche of headlines and clips for you on today's opening segment, and a lot of work I put into it, so thank you very much for those of you that are staying and listening. You're the kindest, and if you wait till the very end, there's a special nickname for those of you who listen to all the way to the end of the podcast. You know what it is if you heard it, but I'll let you know again today if you listen all the way to the end. Little nugget, little Easter egg at the end of the program. Also, thank you to the very many of you that reached out to me in the morning, early in the morning. Love how early so many of you listen to it. The podcast usually posts at midnight, by the way, available usually a little after midnight. But many of you reached out and told me that there was an editing, and auditing. See, I'm like Trump. I don't misspeak. I just say it with confirmation and confidence. An editing mistake where I left out the clip from Hakeem Jeffries. Apparently, I introduced it and then just didn't play it. Well, screw you, Hakeem Jeffries. Sorry about that, everybody. Anyway, if you really wanted to hear that Hakeem Jeffries clip, I'll include it in today's audio roundup. By the way, I always appreciate when you reach out to me and let me know there's an editing error. I check it and I check it again, but every once in a while an error slips through, but it could do it a little bit more constructively. I think the first person I heard from yesterday morning about this was my friend Zach in Missouri, who texted me and said, "Morning, Pete, just want to let you know that your audio clip from Hakeem Jeffries didn't make it on the actual production. What is wrong with you? Why do I pay for this? You're worse than Hitler." Wow. I mean, seems pretty harsh, Zach. Not to be topped by Nick Martino, who texted me and said, "Hey, happy Monday. I'm never sure whether to text you with this shit. I know you're having a bunch of early morning or nighttime listeners, but I think you forgot to add the 1-minute Hakeem Jeffries clip, you piece of shit." Jesus. Nick, come on, man. A text from Joe, who said, "Morning, buddy. The Hakeem Jeffries clip isn't there. I hope you die." Jesus, Joe. And then finally, my friend Dougie out in Wyoming reached out towards the end of the day and said, "I'm sure you've heard from people that you're a piece of shit screw up, and I hope your shed burns while you're in it because you didn't include that Hakeem Jeffries clip." So, guys, I mean, I appreciate you reaching out. I do, but it just seems like some of these comments are, well, pretty harsh. So maybe tone it down a notch, fellas. I'm just one guy, an independent producer, host, editor, booker. I mean, I do it all. It's not easy. So if you could be a little more forgiving and understanding, I'd appreciate it. But let's first get to the headlines, and a reminder, can't do any of it without your support. Thank you for signing up for a paid subscription at patreon.com/Pete Dominic. To learn more, standupwithpete.com. Let's do it. News, notes, and headlines from the last 24 hours, and what a past day it was. Let's start in Gaza, where the New York Times reporting that Israel's begun an invasion of southern Gaza, the last section of the territory that's been under full Hamas control, with dozens of armored vehicles rolling closer to its main city and strikes pummeling urban areas. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Times showed that the Israeli military had pushed into southern Gaza between Friday and Sunday, soon after the collapse of its week-long truce with Hamas. The move sets the stage for what is likely to be the decisive battle of the war, a showdown in Khan Yunis, the largest city in the south, where Israeli officials believe Hamas's military and political leadership has sought shelter since fleeing from the north. The Israeli military has not confirmed a ground invasion of the south, although it's been signaling one for days and warning civilians in several areas to evacuate. The invasion is expected to compound the dire living conditions in an area widely damaged by airstrikes, beset by communications outages, and overcrowded with displaced civilians struggling with disease and shortages of water, food, fuel, and medical equipment. It sounds like hell on earth for the Palestinians who are trapped in Gaza, and I can't quite imagine anything worse. But in New York City, protesters called on the UN to condemn sexual violence that Hamas is accused of committing during its October 7th attacks. And that is what I have for you on the war between the Palestinians and the Israelis taking place in Gaza. Other than Politico reporting that Biden administration officials have spent weeks quietly drafting a multi-phase post-war plan that envisions a revamped Palestinian Authority ultimately taking over the Gaza Strip. Well, I'm sure that will work out just perfectly. An American-engineered plan for, in this case, the Palestinian Authority sounds great. Obviously, the question that was asked even before the invasion started was, what will come the day after the invasion? What will come the day after the war? And, of course, there is still, in my opinion, I've seen no good answers from anybody, specifically the Israeli government and IDF, who are obliterating Gaza and Gazans, Palestinian people. All right, let's leave the war in Gaza and head to the Supreme Court where, I don't know, I'm not going to continue with some war metaphor, but the Supreme Court heard arguments today over a bankruptcy deal for Purdue Pharma that would give billions of dollars to those harmed by the opioid epidemic in exchange for shielding its owners, the Sackler family. Oh, look, it's the Sacklers. Hey, are the Sacklers coming for Thanksgiving? No, because they are the worst family in America, maybe? Anyway, it's going to shield them from additional opioid-related lawsuits from the families of victims and other addicts, of course. The Justice Department office had challenged the deal, saying it violated federal law. Justices seemed divided, reflecting the tension between the practical effect of unraveling the settlement and broader concerns about whether the Sacklers should be granted such wide-ranging immunity. I'll get some audio from PBS Supreme Court analyst on that coming up. And in a blunt letter addressed to the House Speaker, Shalonda Young, that's the White House budget director, who is very widely respected across the political spectrum, warned yesterday that the U.S. would run out of money to send weapons to Ukraine by the end of the year if Congress did not approve additional aid. The potential loss in American assistance, she wrote, would, quote, kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield. The message was the latest Biden administration salvo against a growing number of Republicans who say they are weary of shouldering the costs and the political capital of a war that could grind on for years. And now let's head to Dubai, where climate experts assailed the leader of COP28. I'll be talking with Emily Atkin and posting that conversation coming up after this one. But since the UN Climate Summit began last week, tensions have been simmering around the decision to hold the major event in one of the world's biggest oil-producing countries. And yesterday, the anger burst out into the open when Sultan Al Jaber, an Emirati oil executive, who's also, by the way, the president of the conference this year, launched into an angry public defense of his position on ending fossil fuel use. Al Jaber had been under fire for a video from 2 weeks ago in which he said there is, quote, no science to support a phase out of oil and gas in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. After critics attacked his comments, Al Jaber suggested he had not said what he can be heard saying on the video. Again, I'll talk with Emily Atkin of Heated.World about this and everything else going on in COP28 coming up in the next episode of this podcast. Don't miss it because she's awesome. Let's see, what else do I have for you here in news and notes? A former U.S. diplomat was accused of working for decades as a secret agent for Cuba while rising up the ranks in the State Department. The trial of actor Jonathan Majors, who was charged with assaulting his girlfriend, began yesterday. Democratic governors advised President Biden to talk more about abortion and less about Donald Trump. And one of those where were you when you found out moments yesterday. I know exactly where I was when I found out that the governor of North Dakota, that guy Doug Burgum, the billionaire with the billionaire eyebrows, the wealthy former software executive, apparently sadly dropped out of the race for the Republican nomination. Really thought he had that tied up. I don't know who's going to fill the billionaire lane now. What will GOP primary voters do without that option? Don't kid yourself. They're all voting for Trump. Love to be wrong, though. Come on, Iowa. Days after an Osprey aircraft went down off the coast of Japan, the United States Air Force said the bodies of 5 crew members had been found. Sad news from the Air Force in that accident off the coast of Japan. But here's some good news. Following a multi-year conservation effort, New Zealand's national bird, the kiwi, hatched eggs near the capital for the first time in living memory. How about that? All right, now let's get to some sound. Those are your headlines. All right, let's start, of course, with that sound from Hakeem Jeffries. I really built it up. It's not that amazing or anything, but he was up, as I mentioned yesterday, giving the keynote speech to New Hampshire Democrats.
Now, Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. FDR had the New Deal. Truman had the Fair Deal. What President Biden, Democrats, all of us have accomplished in the last few years is a big deal. It's a big deal. Now, Joe Biden says it a different way. I left out a word, y'all, but it's a big deal because we run to win, we win to govern, but we govern to get big things done and make life better for everyday Americans. And under the leadership of Joe Biden, Annie Kuster, Chris Pappas, Senator Shaheen, Democrats are just getting started. Just getting started. And we're going to work hard to finish the job.
There you go, Hakeem Jeffries. I hope the audio made it. I mean, I just heard it. It's got to be there. Unless I somehow go back and erase it, it's definitely there. All right, now I want to play for you from PBS. This is NewsHour contributor and Supreme Court analyst Marsha Coyle on that case about Purdue Pharma's bankruptcy deal that would give billions of dollars to the victims of opioid epidemic while protecting the Sackler family from opioid-related civil suits.
The big picture, what are they considering here?
Well, first of all, the real issue before the court is whether the bankruptcy court here had the authority somewhere in the code or elsewhere to approve a settlement that does give immunity basically to the Sackler family, as you said, from all civil opioid-related claims, even though the Sackler family was not part of this bankruptcy. They themselves did not apply for bankruptcy. So the justices were probing both sides with some skeptical questions of both sides on whether there is authority for this. But also what was interesting, Jeff, is it was very clear that the justices have their eye on the practical implications of a decision. If they find that there was no authority, is it possible that there's a better deal to be negotiated, as the United States trustee suggested? Or will there be a race to the courthouse by individual claimants where one claimant with a huge claim could zap all the assets of the corporation should that claimant win, and nothing will be left for anyone else?
All right. Well, we'll get more analysis on that case and, of course, a decision in June. We'll see and stay on top of that. But wanted to keep you updated on that one because I haven't talked about it with Siegel or any other Supreme Court experts, analysts, commentators. Now let's move on to yesterday's newest bullshit from Republicans. This comes from the House Oversight Committee, who is now being called Comer Pile, which is hilarious. Congressman James Comer of Kentucky released a new piece of, quote, evidence claiming, again, that Hunter Biden was funneling money to his father, President Joe Biden. But, of course, a tiny bit more investigating proved it wasn't much of a bombshell after all. The new evidence was touted on the Oversight Committee's social media and was accompanied by a video of Comer explaining that the proved President Biden was receiving, quote, direct monthly payments from his son through his company, and the evidence they presented were bank documents. But upon closer examination and after further investigation by journalists and intrepid social media users, the amount of deposits from son to father that took place was in total $4,000. It was $4,000. 3 payments of $1,380 that were repayment for money that Hunter Biden borrowed from his dad during a rough patch for his Ford Raptor truck that he got. So what it proves really is that Hunter Biden made good on a loan from his father, kept track of the repayments on an actual spreadsheet, and doesn't at all paint a picture of a corrupt financial scheme. But hey, who cares about the truth? And I think somebody needs to explain to Comer Pile how loans work, because here he is on Newsmax saying this.
You can loan people money. If they pay you back, then you benefited directly from the influence peddling scheme. Because
what? He said influence peddling scheme there at the end, in case you couldn't make it out because he said so quickly. If you pay someone back a loan, you're I mean, I just can't. But here's more. This is Congressman Byron Donalds, whose career inspiration was Samuel Jackson's character in Django Unchained. Anyway, this new cockamamie theory about the loan being fraudulent, influence peddling from China, I know, hard to believe, of course, rattled around in the right-wing echo chamber. Here it is last night on Fox News.
Now, Congressman, switching gears, the Oversight Committee that you're on says that in 2018, Hunter Biden sent payments to his father using a business account that received payments directly from China. According to the subpoenaed records, the payments were nearly $1,400 and happened monthly. Hunter's defense is that he was paying his dad back for car payments.
Oh, what car? This is a joke. Listen, one of the things, I'm from the banking industry. One of the things that we always knew.
Let me just say for a moment, what car? There's literally a picture. You can all find it online. There's a picture of Joe Biden with Hunter Biden in front of the truck the day they bought it at the dealership. But I interrupt Byron Donalds lying in support of Big Daddy.
Is that if there were these loan agreements that were floating out there with no actual loan document, that is tantamount to money laundering and tax evasion.
Okay, well, it's money laundering and tax evasion now. Ron Filipowski, who is going to hopefully join me on the podcast for the first time tomorrow, by the way, tweeted this about it. The Saudis gave Jared $2 billion to manage with massive payouts to him, and he was in government for like 5 minutes before that, dealing with Middle East policy. And James Comer, talking about $4,000 truck payment in 2018, and for someone who was never in government, from someone who wasn't at the time. Crazy and perfectly put by Ron Filipowski. Can't wait to talk to him. All right, well, I wanted to play you great clips of Liz Cheney, who has been making the rounds because she's got a new book out. She's on the Today Show yesterday and last night. She was also on the Rachel Maddow show, which is kind of weird seeing them together, but I don't think I need to really set these up. I'll just lay them out for you.
The way that I look at it is those of us on the right in this moment have a particularly great responsibility and duty because this threat has emerged from the right. Yeah. We can talk about why that was. I think that frankly, there are millions of people around the country who feel like they aren't heard. And Donald Trump managed to convince them that he would be their voice, which is, of course, a complete lie, but they bought it. And he preyed on that patriotism. But right now, it's, I think, partly why I have been so disappointed with what I've seen from other members of my party in their unwillingness to step up. I think we have a particular duty to step up.
All right, one more from Liz Cheney on Rachel Maddow's show last night, where she talked about that Republicans and Democrats need to unite at least in preventing Donald Trump from returning to power.
And, there was a moment right after January 6th where I was having dinner with my husband and our two youngest kids, who happened to be our sons. And I looked at my sons across the dinner table, and I had this realization, I grew up in a country where I didn't have to wonder if we were going to have a peaceful transfer of power in the United States. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, my God, maybe they won't be able to say the same thing. And that is why it's so fundamentally important that we ensure Democrats, independents, Republicans, that we work together, we vote together, we make clear that Donald Trump is not an acceptable alternative. He is not the lesser of two evils. He is a completely unfit man for office. He's already shown us what he would do, and he can never be near the Oval Office again.
But some people on Twitter, after seeing that interview with Rachel Maddow, were asking why she didn't ask about Liz Cheney about the Washington Post story that was specifically about her January 6th duties and included the important passage. Don Winslow tweeted it out, at least, as well as others. Cheney did not want the committee to investigate Ginny Thomas, a conservative activist and the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, according to people involved with the investigation. Cheney did not think it was fair to target the justice without evidence that he was involved, according to those involved, but some Democrats instead saw this as an effort to protect her hardcore Republican credentials. Cheney also clashed with Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida, a Democrat, over how much to focus on Trump versus other Republicans, according to those involved. And so, I don't know if that was the journalistic malpractice, but would have definitely been a good question to ask. All right, I got two more clips for you. And just for your information, regular listeners of the podcast and this news segment, I'm trying to keep it to about 20 minutes. I'm trying to keep the whole podcast around an hour 15. But sometimes I go more, and that's okay because you can start and stop and play whenever you want. But I know I'm already into the 21-minute mark or so here, so I just can't not play these clips. I gather them all day, and maybe you listen in time and a half or even double speed, as I do sometimes, some of the podcasts, especially things that just straight news like this, to get more information in less time. Either way, here it is. I thought this is a really important moment between Jake Tapper, who I think is doing really exceptional job reporting on what is happening in Israel and Gaza. He's a very proud Jewish guy. I know Jake Tapper, and I know his heart hurts to see this happening, but I think he's as fair of a job as he can. And yesterday, I think it's fair to say he was visibly disgusted after senior advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mark Regev, who you've probably seen making the rounds, basically victim blamed 9 members of a CNN producer's family who were killed during Israel's bombing in Gaza. It's tough to listen to for several different reasons, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. Here it is from his appearance yesterday on CNN's The Lead, Mark Regev.
In comparative numbers, if you compare Israel to perfection, of course we'll fall short. But if you compare Israel to other Western armies who've been fighting terrorists in built-up urban areas, I think Israel will not come out badly in the comparison. On the contrary, I think it will be seen that the IDF really has done everything that is humanly possible to try to safeguard innocent civilians.
It's very hard to believe that, especially on a day when one of our producers lost 9 members of his family who were not members of Hamas, not members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, not members of any group, just 9 people just trying to live their lives.
First of all, I extend my sorrow to him and my sympathies. But if I saw your report correctly, and please correct me if I say something wrong, that happened in northern Gaza, in Gaza City, where a month ago we already asked all the civilians to leave. And most of them did. If there was like 1,200,000 people there was only a couple of tens of thousands left. And one has to ask, yes, they had ample opportunity to leave. I don't know what happened. I don't have the specific circumstances. I know there's deadly combat going on now in the north, still between these IDF and Hamas terrorists, yes? And we don't want to see anyone caught up in the crossfire, but why didn't they heed the advice and leave the area?
You can't blame them. There's now
I don't blame them.
But you can't. There's fighting in the south now. I've been asking this since October 7th. Where are these people supposed to go?
So at the beginning, it was easier because the fighting was concentrated in the north, and we just asked people to move south, and that was relatively simple. Yes, I'm not saying totally simple, but relatively simple. Just go south of the river. But now we're being more specific because it is more complicated in the south. We've actually designated areas in the south which are safer areas, which are especially there's a number of them. We've shared the maps with the United States. It's been shared also with the UN and the other humanitarian organizations. Listen, we have to hit Hamas in Khan Yunis. They've got a strong military infrastructure there. They've got a network of tunnels. If we want to destroy Hamas's military machine, and we have to act in the south as well. Senior Hamas commanders are there under the ground in Khan Yunis. We can't not go there. But in going there and to defeat Hamas, we're also going to make a major effort once again to try to safeguard civilian lives. And that's why we're urging people there now to move to the new areas that we've specified. And as the ground operation starts, I can assure you that the escape routes, the humanitarian corridors that will allow civilians to get out of harm's way will still be there.
Mark Regev, thank you so much.
And there you go. So let me know what you think of that. And by the way, I read this article yesterday at The Nation magazine by Jeet Heer, titled "Biden's Bear Hug of Netanyahu is a Disaster. The renewed fighting between Israel and Hamas shows the incoherence of mixing humanitarian words and bigger bombs." And Jeet here references Lloyd Austin. He's the Secretary of Defense's warning about the strategy because it's a war, as the Secretary of Defense has noted, that makes little strategic sense. Far from defeating Hamas, it will radicalize a new generation of Palestinians, says the Secretary of Defense, and so many other people who probably could have told you that before the war began. And certainly, if you're an American who covered and lived through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw just that effect happening as the result of our unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country. But he writes, realizing this reality, Netanyahu is now shopping around a proposal to, quote, thin out Gaza's population and expel the surviving residents into neighboring countries, a proposal that he is pitching to leaders of both parties in Congress. He goes on to write that this policy, amounting to a second Nakba, would not only be a moral atrocity, it would destroy the reputation of Israel and the United States around the world for decades to come. Consequences of this policy in terms of future terrorism and also loss of international credibility and fraying of alliances would become incalculable. Those are his words, his analysis over at The Nation magazine. So consider the source and the credibility of his work, but I think it's a really interesting and provocative essay that he wrote. I want to mention it, but I'm not going to end on that. Let's have some laughs here before we get to my interview with David Cay Johnston. On last night's episode of Last Week Tonight on HBO, hosted by John Oliver, of course, the audience warmed up by yours truly, although I wasn't there for this weekend's taping, long story, but I will be for the last two episodes of the season. Anyway, he had Bill Nye, the science guy, on, and they wrote this great bit for him. And you see on screen Bill Nye sitting there with a giant globe, which he lights on fire in this bit that they had him do. And it's great because, of course, we know Bill Nye as a science educator for kids. Many of us watched him growing up, and they made him go pretty blue, pretty dirty with the language, and it's, I think, real good. Better to watch, but still pretty funny to listen to. Here he is, lighting the globe on fire.
Here, I've got an experiment for you. Safety glasses on. By the end of this century, if emissions keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. What I'm saying is the planet's on fucking fire. There are a lot of things we could do to put it out. Are any of them free? No, of course not. Nothing's free, you idiots. Grow the fuck up. You're not children anymore. I didn't mind explaining photosynthesis to you when you were 12, but you're adults now, and this is an actual crisis. Got it? Safety glasses off, motherfuckers.
All right, I know. Little dark, but funny, Bill Nye on Last Week Tonight. All right. Well, here we are, 28 minutes in. Sorry, I'm a little heavy on the opening segment, but I had a lot to get to. I had a lot to share with you, and I'm very excited now, though, to share with you my headliner for the show. Always the best part of the program, I like to think. The interview. It's time to talk with the great David Cay Johnston. Don't forget the T, folks. Of course, he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001. He's written 4 bestsellers, and he's been an investigative reporter for 57 years. That's right. I interviewed him several times over my career at SiriusXM, talking about his books, Free Lunch, Perfectly Legal, and The Fine Print. He's also now written 3 books. I mentioned one a couple times. 3 books about Donald Trump, which are also really good. You can find him at dcreport.org. He's still on Twitter/X at DavidKJ. And to find out more about David Cay Johnston, in the show notes, of course, with his whole bio. But I love this guy. I'm always happy when I get to talk to him. And he knows so much about so many different economic and financial and legal issues. And he happens to know Donald Trump very, very well, having covered him for a long time as a journalist in New York. So I was real happy to catch up with him and get his take on all of what we talked about. Let's do it right now with the great David Cay Johnston. Oh, there he is. The legend joins us now. You asked for him. People asked for you. They said, where is David Cay Johnston? When are you going to talk to him? How about right now? Hello, sir.
I think this would be a great moment. It will save me from restoring all the books in my office, which got flooded with a broken water pipe.
You're sitting in front of a huge empty bookcase, and I thought maybe you were sick.
No.
You're giving away all of your books.
Yeah, well, throughout lots of water-soaked books. That's true. But,
you know, you mentioned the books that are no longer on your bookcase because you had a water issue, which is terrible. But I feel, and I've said this many times to you on my various iterations of the show, that your books have been impactful in my understanding of our financial system and our tax code as anything ever written, particularly Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and of course, the fine print. You've written other books. You've written a book about Trump. You've written other articles. But I wonder, when you look back at your career, specifically your books, your long form journalism there, what you think is, still really the most relevant for someone today to read and understand, given, the time that's passed since you wrote them, with the tax code, with economics, with the financial system in general.
Well, it's things in 2 of the 3 books in my economic trilogy. In Perfectly Legal, people, before that book came out, ordinary citizens didn't know, but tax lawyers did, that the whole tax game was to defer your income. If you don't have to pay a tax today for 30 years, you're actually making money off the tax system. And people didn't understand that, and its enormously corrosive effect on the economy. And then the second one, which is in Free Lunch, is I think pretty much everybody knows now that many corporations use your tax dollars to build a retail store, a shopping mall, a factory, to refurbish a factory. But what nobody knew was back then when the book came out was that's what they were doing. Free Lunch just laid out something, and the book got a very hostile review in the New York Times. I mean, really hostile. And I was a reporter there at the time because this was one of the great it was there, but nobody reported on its secrets, that instead of investors putting up the money, they were looting our local and state governments of money that should be going to schools and fire departments and libraries to give to General Electric and Rupert Murdoch's Fox and other companies. And
yes.
By the way, it's gotten even worse, of course, since then.
That's what I thought in general, that there's the way the pendulum has gone in terms of power and influence on the tax system. It's not been for the public interest. It's been for the private interest.
Right. And who makes the rules and what the rules are is really important. What we're losing sight of in America, because this has gone on for so long, is we don't have to have those rules. I see every day on X, Twitter, Threads, shows that I'm on, people who say, well, it's all over. We can't do anything. The billionaires have all the power. No, they don't. We have all the power. We just have to exercise it. We can have competent, effective government that invests in what builds our economy and what invests in building our economy. Giving money to General Electric doesn't build the economy. Taking money from the schools so that Mitsubishi can assemble cars more cheaply here in America, that doesn't do it. What does? Well, the Commonwealth, infrastructure, roads, bridges, clean water, sewer systems, civil justice, criminal justice systems, investing in science, investing in education. Those things allow anyone who's entrepreneurial to then take advantage of them and build our economy. But this welfare for the rich, and that's what it is. And as you know, in my books, I've documented these unbelievable hundreds of billions of dollars of welfare for rich individuals and for corporations. All that does is redistribute upward and hurt all of us in the long run.
Mostly, sure, right? But I feel like when you point to the cynicism that a lot of people have about there's nothing we can do, and we can talk about money's influence in politics and campaign finance and so on. But I wonder if you have an example, or many, from these giant pieces of legislation that Democrats almost entirely and President Biden signed that will do just that. So we can be as cynical as we want, or we can look at government and this huge piece of legislation, specifically what's called the IRA, but had more of an investment in renewable energy than anywhere ever. And I'm thinking that there's examples like that you can cite that are government working a lot more in the public interest, or maybe someone's going to say, well, we'll see how it shakes out and if it all becomes corrupted and goes into the wrong hands and fails.
Well, first, Pete, let me put a little foundation to this.
Sure.
We have not had a president since maybe Gerald Ford, but he was there for 2 years as a placeholder. So we haven't had a president since LBJ, 1960s, who knew how Washington worked. LBJ was known as the master of the Senate. We've had all these outsiders, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, who was a senator long enough to have a cup of coffee in Washington and then run for the White House, and Donald Trump, who never did a day of public service before he was inaugurated. In comes Joe Biden, a master of Washington, and with a 5-vote majority in the House, the same majority the Republicans have. Well, they only have 4 votes now because they had to expel Santos. But with the same majority, he was able to pass a number of pieces of legislation, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, that are having a fantastic transformative effect on our economy. And it's funny, I keep watching Republicans who voted against these bills, who denounced them as communism or socialism, or they're going to bankrupt the country. When they go to cut the ribbon, they show up and say, see what we've done for you.
It's unbelievable.
And Biden has all the way along been above the fray. He's followed the Obama policy of high road. So he could go lay into some of these people. He could say, you're not welcome. He could even just make a joke about it, but he doesn't. He says, I'm the president of all the people, whether you voted for me or not. Not the exact opposite, by the way, of Donald Trump, who's made it very clear if he gets back in the White House that he's only the president of the people who voted for him. And, they're working on plans to round up people and use the military against the American public. And they're doing it right and open. And if you haven't heard this, I would blame my colleagues or my successors, given my age in journalism, for not covering this. Just a digression for a moment.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Said deplorables. It got 18 times more television coverage than when Donald Trump called those who don't back him vermin. 18 times more coverage.
Wow.
So go back to the fundamental underlying point here. Biden has been focused on putting money into the economy that will grow jobs, grow investments, improve the Commonwealth public furniture. And
manufacture here in America too, right?
Here in America, building the public furniture here in America. I mean, he's sending a lot of money to Ukraine because we, like it or not, we have to do that because if we don't, Putin has announced, he plans to take back the old Soviet Union. And I have relatives by marriage who live in former Iron Curtain countries, and they tell me, if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, the Russian tanks, they're just a few hundred miles away. They're going to be here, and we're going to be under the Russian boot again. So Biden, through the Inflation Reduction Act, is encouraging people to spend money on cleaner fuel that's cheaper. Solar and wind are the cheapest sources of electricity we have today. He is encouraging the development of all sorts of projects that will build the economy, not from the top down, not from giving welfare to corporations that are highly profitable individuals, but by investing in Commonwealth tools as the founders envisioned.
That's well said. Very well said. You should be a speechwriter. That was exactly how, that's how Democrats, I should say, should be delivering that. Or that's how good government should be delivering that, because that's what it's, of course, supposed to be for. And we could talk about that forever with David Cay Johnston. But let me ask you, I wanted to get into some of the things about Trump. Of course, you've written a book about him. You've covered him as a journalist for years. You know him. And I wonder, just first on the Manhattan case with Letitia James, I should say the New York case, right? New York AG. And this is about his business. And my understanding of how it's worked, and I think I've covered it decently well enough to kind of understand the broad outlines, is that basically the decision has already been made that he committed fraudulent crimes and reported or misreported the size of his, all the things that people know about. And so now it's just a decision about what the penalty is going to be, how many hundreds of millions of dollars, and can he still do business in New York? And I wanted to get your read on that case and the consequences around it and what you think is going to happen here.
So let me refine that just a little bit.
Refine it all you want. And then also tell me if this is something that they're only doing to him. One of the arguments that somehow resonates is that they've targeted him and that there's a lot of people that are in real estate who do exactly what he does. And you would know.
Okay. So there are 4 criminal cases. This is the biggest of the many civil cases against Donald Trump.
Got it.
Brought by the elected Attorney General of New York State. And the evidence that Donald Trump, his 2 older sons, and 2 named executives of the Trump Organization persistently engaged in fraud was so overwhelming that the judge granted summary judgment that it's fraud. Now, there are 6 other civil charges. This is a civil, not a criminal case. And those other 6 charges require proving intent, that this wasn't an accident, this was intentional. The law calls it mens rea. By the way, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been a professor of law for many years at Syracuse University's College of Law. And the evidence in this case that has come about so far is overwhelming that they knew what they were doing, that they've lied on the witness stand. Trump and the 2 oldest sons made statements that Zach Everson at Forbes magazine, who I encourage you to have on as a guest, he's done a brilliant job of covering Trump's finances in the last 6 or 7 years, have shown that they were said things under oath in court that Zach Everson has emails and things showing that those were lies, and they knew they were lies. And the reason is, and I say this having known Donald for 35 years, to Donald, the truth is whatever he says. He just makes it up, and you don't believe him? Well, tough luck. And the rest of us live in a world where there's some objective reality and verifiable facts. That is not how Donald sees the world. Right. He's not unique about that. I've covered other people in public life, but none as extreme as Donald in his belief that if I say it, that makes it so, and if you don't agree, fake news. Now, in this trial, the evidence is showing they were flagrant in what they were doing. Donald claimed his apartment in Trump Tower was 30,000 square feet. Nah, it's 11,000. His estate in Westchester County, just north of Manhattan, it's about 20 acres. He bought it for $19 million. He's claimed it was worth as much as $291 million on financial statements. At least at the time they did this, no house in America had sold, I believe, for $100 million. It's not that great of a property. And how did he arrive at this? Well, I'm going to carve it up into mini estates, except the authorities had told him from day one, no, we're not going to let you do that. The zoning and everything for this house, you bought the estate, that's what you have. They knew it was only worth about $20 million, but they said $290 million. Trump says, Mar-a-Lago, it's worth $500 million. You know, well, gee, why did you go to the county tax authorities and insist it's only worth $20 million or so, not $500 million? How about your golf course in Westminster? Donald insists that his 18-hole golf course with a clubhouse that he says is 44,000 square feet, that's an acre, is only worth $1.3 million.
What?
A house on the fairway costs about $700,000. I mean, it's absurd. And, you know, I once challenged the assessment on the house I'm speaking to you from just outside Rochester, New York. And I went in and said, I think you're about $30,000 off. The house at the time, the value was in the neighborhood of $300,000. And the county and I negotiated, and they agreed with me finally, and they took 2/3 of my number. They lowered their assessment. Disagreeing 10% more or less, that's not fraud. 16 times the value of something, 20 times the value of something.
Right.
That is fraud, particularly when you do it again and again, when you write in your documents that, well, this appraiser said that, and then you get the appraisal and you find out the appraiser never said that or anything close to it. And the claim that Trump is selling to the public, and that's who he's appealing to here. He knows that he's going to be wiped out legally, is no one was hurt. Deutsche Bank says we made lots of money off of Donald Trump. Well, here's the problem with that. You and I and the people listening to this want to go get a mortgage. We want to borrow money to start a business. Banks do not have an unlimited amount of money they can loan. The amount of money they can loan is related to the size of the bank's deposits and assets under management. So when Donald Trump gets a loan that's for more money than he was qualified for, that's at a lower interest rate because he appears to be less of a risky client, you and I pay the price. We don't get the loan. We pay a higher interest rate. We get less favorable terms. Now, Deutsche Bank may well have made money. They got lucky, but that's not the point. You don't get to commit fraud and then say, but the other side made money. And let me give you an example of this. Imagine, Pete, that you work for some nightclub operator doing your stand-up, and he closes on Sunday night, and you go into the till and take $100. You go gamble. You win $1,000. When the till reopens the next day, you put $200 into the till. Boy, the owner just made $100 off of you, and you keep the rest of your winnings. Well, first of all, you're a thief, and that's a felony crime you committed, taking the money. Even though the business was closed and there's no practical effect, you put it back before they opened again. And secondly, the money you won at the casino is not your money under the law. It is what the law calls ill-got gains, and you must disgorge them. You must give them up. And what this trial is about is how much disgorgement does Trump have to make because of ill-got gains. And I've said elsewhere, a good long time ago, it is entirely possible that Trump will lose all of his properties, because if they're sold to meet the demand of the state of New York, they're not going to be sold at premium prices. They're going to be sold at fire sale prices. So he won't get nearly as much as he might otherwise get for them. He can bid to buy them back if he wants through an entity in another state. But Donald is out of business in New York State. He cannot run a business in New York State.
Well, I don't understand that. When you say if sold to meet demand, are you saying that the penalty is $250 million, and the only way Donald Trump's going to be able to pay that is to sell these buildings? Or are you saying that demand is from the New York State? You no longer get to own things here. You have to sell them.
Yeah, both things are true, Pete. The judge canceled Donald Trump's business licenses. This is New York, so we call them business certificates. You and I can operate. I can write. You can do podcasts as Pete Dominick, David Cay Johnston. The state has no role there except we have to pay our taxes. But if you create Pete Dominick Limited Liability Company, I create David Cay Johnston, Inc. We are now working through entities, artificial persons, that are creatures of the state government. Donald Trump has so violated the rules of these entities that they've all had their licenses canceled. Now, they've been temporarily restored by an appellate court while the trial proceeds, but they will be taken away again. And without a business license, the properties will be handled by a receiver, sort of like bankruptcy, not exactly the same, but similar, who will then sell these properties. And because these are forced sales, they're not going to bring premium prices for Donald. Now, the $250 million is what the AG asked for. The judge might rule that it's $10, and he might rule that it's $10 billion Trump owes. We don't know. That's the judge to decide at the end of the case. The $250 million is sort of the standard, is the basic request. And the state gets paid first. The government gets paid first. The shareholder, the creditors, if any, mortgage holders, they get paid second. Donald gets paid last. He's at the end of the line here.
When does Eric get paid? That's all I care about. Well, but just to be clear, this is a New York State thing. Why does that matter? Well, Donald Trump has made a lot of his money and has a lot of his contacts and a lot of his property in New York. I don't know what the percentages are. Obviously, he has stuff all over the world, or certainly all over the U.S. I don't know. But it doesn't mean, this decision doesn't mean he can't go to Pennsylvania or New Jersey, or more likely a state where a lot of people like him, and throw his name up on a condo, right?
Absolutely. What it means is that the entities that are based in New York, even if the property they own, like Mar-a-Lago, is in Florida, no longer will be able to do business in New York. But Trump is free in any other state to go do business if they want to put up with him. And then they can decide if they think he's acted improperly. And by the way, this is going to be after the judge issues his rulings. This will be tied up in appeals for forever, because that's Trump's game. He'll try and delay and keep this going for 10, 20 years if he can. But Trump is out of business in New York as soon as this case is over. Trump, one of the things that's almost certainly going to be sold is what he owns of Trump Tower. He owns his 3-story apartment on the top. He owns the office space and he owns the retail space. He does not own the residences. Those were all sold off. That's something that's going to be sold and may well see the name Trump disappear as it has from a number of other buildings in New York City and elsewhere.
Is it true they're going to put Letitia James' name on the building?
I don't know. They might put my name on it since I played a key role in raising all these issues.
It's very long. The whole thing is very long. I don't know if it'll fit. So I want to ask you I want to ask you obviously about this some economics here. But before I do, just want to get your take on all of the rest of Donald Trump's legal troubles. Again, you're just one of the best people to talk about him, his legal issues, and his crimes. And so just in terms of the other cases and the judges and all of it, your thoughts.
Well, the case that's going to come last and is the least important is the one brought by the Manhattan District Attorney over the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels.
Yeah.
There's a much stronger case to be brought. I wrote a New York Daily News piece saying to Alvin Bragg, here's a slam dunk win for you. And it's pretty rare when there's a criminal case that's a slam dunk win. But they committed other criminal frauds that are in the public record that make it very, very easy to establish. He's not doing that case for whatever reason. And he's going to go last. The most important case, which will go next to last, it appears, is the case in Florida where Trump took thousands and thousands of pages of national security documents, at one point stored them in a bathroom. He had his lawyers certify under oath to the court that he had returned all the documents when he had not. We now know that he was told, if you have any documents, you've committed a crime. And he goes, I get that. I understand, which is devastating testimony for him. And we also know that he gave away, perhaps sold, we don't have proof of that yet, national security secrets. You and I and the other people listening to this podcast have invested tens of billions of dollars just in learning how to make submarine screws, the propellers that are super silent, don't have tiny air bubbles, so they can't be heard. And our submarines can move about, even though they're 500 feet long, the biggest ones. You can't hear them in the ocean. And he told an Australian businessman who was up for a contract how close we can get to a Soviet sub before they know we're there.
It's unbelievable that he did that.
Anybody else would be remanded for that right now. They would be held in custody.
Yeah.
If you think that's the only time he did it and it was a mistake, you don't know Donald Trump.
Right.
Donald has been, I'm sure, shooting his mouth off to people left and right because it's just who he is. So that case is being delayed by the judge he appointed, Judge Eileen Cannon, who's overseeing it. And you'll recall in her almost very first motion in the court record, she said Donald Trump deserves special treatment. No, I'm sorry. This is America. No one gets special treatment.
Well, Judge Chutkan, I'm sure you're going to get to that case. Judge Chutkan said something very much diametrically different.
That's coming. Yeah, that's going to come back. So the next, there is the Florida case with Fani Willis, the local district attorney, of the effort to overthrow the voting results in Georgia. And already we've seen several people come in and plead guilty. There are other people who I'm astonished they haven't entered guilty pleas. It may also be that the district attorney has said, we don't need you. You got nothing useful to offer. We got our case. We're not going to make you a deal. We're going to convict you at trial. And, you know, I don't have any doubt prosecutors said to the people who've turned themselves in, Jenna Ellis, for example, a Trump lawyer who has now recanted everything, here's your option. You can walk with no prison time, or you can risk 15 years in a Georgia prison. The algebra there isn't hard.
Do they get hotter there, those prisons, without air conditioning?
I wouldn't want to be in any prison in the South. I wouldn't want to be in any prison anywhere, but especially not in the South. And so that case, the evidence is overwhelming also against Trump. That doesn't mean some juror might vote to acquit, so they get a hung jury, but the evidence there is quite overwhelming. And if Donald is convicted in Georgia, he cannot do anything about it because presidential pardons, even if he gets back to the White House, are only for offenses against the United States. They are only for federal crimes. That brings us to the case likely to be tried first, and that is the Washington, D.C. insurrection case. Our Constitution says that if you committed rebellion or insurrection, or gave aid or comfort to insurrection and rebellion, just aid or comfort, you're not eligible to hold office and you've committed a crime. And Donald Trump keeps arguing that, no, I have a get out of jail free card. You can't prosecute me because these are my official acts as president of the United States. And the judge in the case very eloquently says, trying to overturn an election is not an official act of the office of the president of the United States. Trump has argued he was never an officer of the United States. I mean, you take an oath, I will faithfully execute the duties of the office of president. I'm not taking an oath to the Constitution, he says. That got laughed out of court. Then he argues, well, this will impinge on my First Amendment rights to run for president of the United States. And the judge goes, you did not get a get out of prosecution free card. We have one president at a time, and you're not a king, and you're like any other citizen. Donald Trump's a private citizen now.
That's Judge Chutkan just yesterday or 2 days ago.
Friday, I think it was, yeah. And Donald will, of course, appeal these things, and higher courts, I believe even the U.S. Supreme Court will say, based on some earlier rulings involving Trump, no, you're not special, as Judge Cannon said. You get treated like any other criminal defendant. That case will go to trial before the elections. And what do the polls show? I'm not big on polls, especially now, because fewer than 1 in 100 people respond, and they're done primarily with landlines. Well, older people like me have landlines. My children and grandchildren, I don't think any of them have a landline. And one of the most prominent pollsters in the country, who lives here in Rochester, a big polling center in Rochester for decades, says you just can't rely on the polls these way. And by the way, at this point in the careers of Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and George Bush, they weren't going to get reelected. They all did. It's nonsense to pay attention to those at this stage. But in any event, if Trump has to campaign at night because he sits in a courtroom during the day, because in America, if you're on criminal trial, you must be present for every single second of the proceedings. That's nobody's fault but his. He's the one who's delayed. He could have demanded a speedy trial, and he could have had the trial over with by now.
So much more to ask you about that, and I'm not sure.
We can talk on another day, too.
Yeah, Pete. I mean, as you're talking, I'm like, you have such a comprehensive look, given your career and your credibility, especially on Trump. You really should be the go-to guy, and I know you are for a lot of reporters. But anyway, final question I wanted to really ask you is about the current economy and the perceived economy in terms of how people feel and why that is, because you've been posting a lot about that over on Twitter X still. And are you anywhere else, by the way, that we should be?
Well, I post stuff at Threads. I've taken, after working full-time since I was 13 years old for more than 60 years, I took about 6 or 8 months off. I'm now back to doing some work, and I'll be in the New Republic a number of times in the months ahead. The New Republic has got a different owner, and it's been revived, and has one of the best editors in America, Michael Tomasky.
Yeah.
It's an honor to write for him.
Michael's great.
But a lot of people are just convinced the economy is terrible, and they'll point to two things. They'll point to food prices and gas prices. Well, gas prices have come down dramatically. You can go to the internet and just put in the question, gasoline prices by month, and you'll see that, yeah, they peaked pretty badly in the summer of, I guess it was 21, 22, but they've come down very sharply. There are places now in America where gasoline's under $3 a gallon. The other is food prices, and some food items have been expensive. And to people who are in the bottom 90% of our society, all of whom make less than $100,000 a year, or it's about the threshold, is right around $100,000. Food and gasoline are a much bigger part of their spending than mine, than yours. And as a result, those are things they pay very close attention to. And then secondly, my peers in the news media are just god-awful about this stuff. You know, Donald Trump promised 5-6% economic growth. He delivered an average of 1.2 And if you exclude the pandemic, he delivered less than 3, just subpar performance, below the average since World War II. Joe Biden comes in, and we're now getting 5% economic growth, more than 5%. So what's the headline? Will 5% GDP growth cause Biden new woes?
Right.
It's like, what was this false construct?
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that the right has these people who constantly attack news reports. I've been the subject of a lot of this stuff, and I always find it hilarious when they call me a socialist or a communist. I point out, I'm sorry, I wrote 3 best-selling books that champion competitive market capitalism. Kind of hard to make me out to be a socialist. They have so cowed the news media that people are worried who edit that they will be accused of bias. Many years I worked at the New York Times. If I wrote something that was attributed to the Heritage Foundation or Cato, the libertarian outfit, never did an editor question their bona fides. But if I quoted Good Jobs First or the Economic Policy Institute, well, we need to explain who's funding these people and where their ideas come from. And it was absolutely consistent. This distrust of anything that wasn't on the right, even though I was able to document to editors internally, look, here's a whole series of just flat out falsehoods told by this group on the right. And here's a whole series of things that turned out to be empirically correct in the future as they predicted, and that the data is not being played games with. And still it would be skepticism. And this is really awful. We need to have stop. We need to get away from this "what's wrong with Biden" thing, which is we see this with Democratic presidents. We saw it with Obama.
Yep.
You didn't see any headlines in 2003 that said, is George Bush crazy for invading Iraq? Or, how the tone of the coverage is always very tending to.
Because of what you say, the concern that these media outlets like the New York Times and others, CNN and others, are afraid of being criticized as being liberal. But what's interesting is that critics like yourself, who have a tremendous amount of credibility, and so many others, from Jay Rosen, or I'm trying to think of other, Robert.
Jay Rosen is a very good example.
Robert Reich or anybody else, like they're not as concerned about the criticism coming from the quote left or progressive or enlightened, or as I call it, Earth One media these days. Like, why not be concerned about how, I'm still a New York Times subscriber, but how much of a punchline they've become, that there's huge social media accounts created just to mock like their headlines.
Right. And be publish and be damned is what the Knights used to own. I worked for 2 of their papers, the Detroit Free Press and Philadelphia Inquirer.
I like that.
Publish and be damned. Jay Rosen, who I disagree with sometimes, but I have great respect for. He's a professor at New York University in journalism. He says the problem is, I always said the problem in journalism is we cover the horse race and not the policy. Jay has a better take on that. He says we're covering the horse race and not the stakes. And in this case, the stakes are that Donald Trump has publicly declared, his people around him have publicly declared that they intend to turn us into a dictatorship. They're talking about their plans to use the U.S. military against citizens. Trump says he's going to get retribution against people he perceives to be his enemies. He says, I'm not going to make the mistake I made the last time. Stephen Miller, his minister of hate, who, when he graduated from Santa Monica High School, the talk he was giving was not the one he'd shown the principal, and he went into this racist diatribe, and they'd take him off the stage.
Yeah.
He wants to round up millions of Americans and put them in camps, or millions of people who are here without permission. And if Trump gets in the White House on a larger scale, he will just hand Ukraine over to Putin and stand by while NATO countries are invaded despite our treaty obligations, that's law. Right. We sign a treaty, that's law under our Constitution. This is actually an election where the stakes are enormously important because Donald Trump is unfit to hold any public office, even elected dog catcher. He doesn't know anything. Donald claims to be the world's greatest expert on 22 subjects. Nobody is the world's greatest expert on one subject. And on some of the subject he says he's an expert on, I've shown in my books and my 3.5 Trump books, one of them in 1992, that he doesn't know anything. It's all a con. He is what people need to understand. Donald Trump is the greatest con artist in the history of the world. He is a white-collar crime boss. He doesn't break people's legs, doesn't kill people. He cheats them with contracts and delays and false promises. And he's not unique about that. There are a lot of other people. And as for his defense, well, lots of people in New York are doing the things we did with inflating our assets. Well, there's no requirement that the government prosecute all the rest of them, and there's no refuge for you because you got caught and they didn't. That's the law has established that for hundreds of years. There's what's called prosecutorial discretion. And I certainly agree that if Donald Trump had never run for president, he wouldn't be being pursued in the Stormy Daniels case for sure. But once you choose to raise your profile, instead of law enforcement saying, we can't do everything, we're going to skip this guy, you're going to be in a much different situation.
Yeah. Looks bad for law enforcement, frankly. Yeah. Well, just quickly, though, back to the issue of inflation and economics. I know you've just talked and written about this, and there's ways to study the data here in that there's proof, is my understanding, that a lot of inflation after the initial shock, we could talk about all the issues that started with COVID, supply chain shortages, and so on. A lot of certain percentage of the inflation was companies charging higher prices, gouging because they could, and that never going back down or matching. And you hear me muddling through this thing that I desperately need you to interrupt and explain. Hurry, David, save us.
Corporate profits in the last 2 years rose at more than 6 times the rate of wages. Corporate profits went up enormously. Wages went up a little tiny bit. Now that's starting to change. But the government, as Robert Reich points out, issues all this data on the price of gasoline, the price of eggs, just tons of it. You get lost in it on the internet if you want to start studying it. But we don't issue monthly reports on corporate profits. And because we don't have a lot of competition, my books, my economic trilogy, Defending Market Capitalism, focused on this very point, that we need more competition. That's what brings prices down. Now, rents are starting to come down. House prices are starting to come down. That won't please people who are selling, but it should please people who are buying. The price of goods, manufactured goods, is starting to come down. And there's data of what are called leading indicators. You see the decline now in that segment, and it will show up in the broader data in another 3 to 6 months. So next year, we're going to see, I believe, that the inflation argument is going to largely go away. And remember, inflation peaked at 9% under Biden. It's now down to 3.2%. My whole life, and I'm going to be 75 years old in a few days, has averaged about 3% inflation. I lived through 14% inflation back in the Reagan era. So 3% inflation is not a big deal. The Fed would like it to be 2%. And we likely will get there pretty soon. But the indicators, the forward indicators, are all moving in the right direction. And I believe that Biden, who is a supremely self-confident man, isn't kicking back very much because he doesn't want it to be old news. He's saving his powder for battles to come. And you're going to see more about the improving economy and how the biggest increase in wages, Pete, is occurring among people near the bottom of the income ladder. It's not occurring at the top. I have a piece that I'll send you when it runs in the New Republic that has eye-popping data. Like a lot of the things I write about, I've been the head of the Association of Investigative Reporters, but I think of it as enterprise reporting. A lot of the investigations I've done, there's data right there in the public record, but nobody reads it. And most people don't know how to interpret it.
Right.
You have to learn how to interpret it.
Right. Even if they did, they would, misinterpret or cherry pick whatever they want.
Yeah. And I will be posting something next week or two that will absolutely astound people about a major change. But here's one little thing to know. Donald Trump's last year in office, admittedly an odd year, right? It was the pandemic. 82% of the pay raises in America went to people making more than $1 million a year. That was 1 in 900 workers, and they got 82% of the raises. And what was the average raise for everybody who made less than $1 million? That's 99.999% of the population.
What?
$26.
Ooh.
For the year. 50 cents a week. A little over a penny an hour. $26 was the average.
It's a gumball.
And, that's never happened before. If Trump gets back in, that's going to be the norm. There's going to be more and more of paying people these enormous salaries and not considering that I'm not against, I have no qualm about wealth. I'm a poster boy from going from poor to prosperous. But paying somebody $100 million a year, and there were 500 people that year who made on average just shy of $100 million each from their salary, their salary and their stock options. This is not their investments. This is their pay.
Right. Important distinction.
Yeah. People who are that kind of money motivated, they will work just as hard for 10 million a year as for 100.
Right.
And if you'd spent the other 90 million paying the rest of the staff better, it would make a difference.
Yes, and it's not your opinion either. There's a lot of data on that as well.
Yes.
David Cay Johnston, what I have to say to you is happy birthday. You're an American treasure, and I'm so glad to catch up with you here. I hope those shelves refill with books soon and you get past that water damage. By the way, I do have to ask people like you, were there any confidential top secret documents on those shelves?
I have some of those, but not on those shelves.
Oh.
And two things I always love about being on with you, Pete. A, you're what my youngest child, who's a lyricist, says. You're the opposite of what she says about me. Dad, you're not funny. And the other is you always get the T in my last name. There are so many people who they drop the T, and you never have done that. What has it been, 20 years?
No, not true. I've been reprimanded twice, and those are 2 times that I will never forget. It's always remember to hit the T, because I don't want to feel the scorn of a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter ever again. No, sir.
Oh, it was so long ago, I've forgotten about it.
Yes, I haven't. I wrote about it in my journal. My therapist knows about it. I go, he's one of my favorites. I don't know how I dropped that T, but he was none too pleased, ma'am. David Cay Johnston, the best. Thank you, sir.
Take care, pal.
How about it? That was awesome. David Cay Johnston. Say it right, everybody. Check him out. Look at the show notes and go follow him and go tell him. Please go let him know how much I appreciate having him on. He said he'd love to join me more often, and certainly I would love to have him on more often. He'd be a great person to have stop by and do a hangout and do a Q&A at some point. All right, I got to go. That was awesome. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening, tuning in today. Looking forward to sharing my conversations with Emily Atkin from Heated. I'm also scheduled to talk to Ron Filipowski, who's a big deal on social media and progressive media. Love that guy. Jess Piper is another person I'm scheduled to talk to as well today. She's a former teacher in Missouri who ran for state representative and lost, but has a very interesting story to tell. And now she's the executive director of Blue Missouri and the host of a really interesting podcast. So Jess Piper, Ron Filipowski, Emily Atkin coming up. Who else would you like to hear on the program this week? Always want to hear from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Keep those vitamin N pictures coming, by the way. I want to always share a nature photo with paid subscribers. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. If you're not one already, go write a rating and review on the show on Spotify and Apple iTunes, wherever you listen. And for those of you who listen to the very end, you are my bumblebees. Let me know that you heard it today, and there will be a special gift coming to you in the mail. And by that, I mean nothing at all but my love. Thank you very much, guys. I'll talk to you tomorrow. John Carroll taking us out, as always.
Stand our ground, and then stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers us all a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.